Just as the United States was ramping up its imperial views in the Pacific by annexing Hawaii and uh, committing to having a top notch navy and establishing a South Pacific trade, it became more imperial, but also there were stuff still simmering elsewhere around the world and the Caribbean in particular. And since we're also talking about the South Pacific, there are some islands out there, a large island nation that may also have a bit of turmoil. What do all of these have in common? Well, the Caribbean island I am mentioning is Cuba. Also, another Caribbean island, Puerto Rico. And then that island nation in the South Pacific I mentioned, the Philippines, have all one thing in common. They're all part of the Spanish Empire. Okay? The other things they have in common, actually, they have more than one thing. Elsewhere, they have in common, they have a revolutionary mindset. They want an independent mindset. You see, by this time in the late 1800s, the once very proud Spanish Empire was really just fledgling. They held on to a few of their colonial exploits: Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, a couple of places elsewhere around the world. But this is not the same empire that had ruled for the better part of 400 years. Okay? Um, many countries in Latin America saw what the United States did and the example they set by declaring independence and winning independence with the American Revolution. That would set off a chain reaction of a number of different countries all across the Americas that would follow suit and use that as an example. All throughout Latin America in particular, you had all kinds of countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, eventually Brazil. But you saw that chain reaction. And then, of course, we had the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, to where the United States vowed to protect a lot of these countries and wanted to eliminate European colonialism still existing in Latin America. So the United States was committed to these countries following in their image, which is great. The timing also came together because Cuba in particular had been revolting against the Spaniards for the better part of 20 years by this point in the 1890s. And there had been rumblings of revolts in prior decades that hadn't come to fruition, but this time things were getting a little bit serious. And this time what made other things different was that the United States, we saw this as an opportunity to extend the Monroe Doctrine, but also develop a valuable Caribbean trading partner in Cuba. So hold that thought. Otherwise, though, around this time, you started to see journalism really start to take shape in a more sensationalistic fashion. So, if you turn on CNN today, CNN is drastically different than it used to be. It seems to be this completely tizzied, sensationalist, anti-Donald Trump message. Okay, I'm not exactly Donald Trump's biggest fan. And say what you will about Fox News. Okay, deservedly so a lot of times. But CNN has kind of gone off the rails. They're all in on the anti-Trump train. And they're sensationalizing everything, as the media often tends to do. Oftentimes, you hear in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. That's a common theme among journalists, to where people's eyeballs are attracted to whatever is sensational. Oh boy, somebody got stabbed in Southwest San Antonio. Oh, okay. Oh boy, there was a police chase on I-30 between Dallas and Fort Worth. No way. Let's watch. Let's see what happens. Oh boy, he crashed in the median. Oh, yeah. Who would have thought, right? Okay. But in the meantime, you were watching. Sensationalism in media really gets some notoriety in this time frame. So there's a difference between journalism, reporting facts and whatnot, and sensationalist journalism that's clickbait, basically. You're going to collect people's eyeballs and you're going to have them watch. Well, that's called yellow journalism. Okay, so the sensation style of journalism that rallies the troops, if you will, so to speak, or gets people's attention, gets people thinking, gets people spurred. Okay, so this sort of journalism starts to kind of take America a little bit by storm, and it especially starts to happen as the Cuban Revolution starts to heat up. Now, not all Cubans were revolutionaries. There were quite a number of Cubans who were loyal to the Spanish colonies who were anti-revolution and didn't want to break away. So in Cuba, also going along with this possible revolutionary movement, you have pro-Spanish Cubans who would put together various different protests and riots in Havana against Cuban independence. Well, the United States, remember, we're starting to build a navy. We wanted to kind of see, okay, let's kind of see what's going on in Havana. We're going to put a ship there in Havana just to kind of see if we need to intervene at all. Ideally not, but we want to see. Well, in February of 1898, there was a curious explosion on that naval ship, the USS Maine. It was curiously attacked, so to speak. And the attack was pretty brutal. There were about 260 Americans that died on that ship. Okay? The explosion was blamed on pro-Spanish sympathizers, if not Spaniards themselves. Whether or not that actually happened, I don't know. Okay? A lot of historians debate as to whether or not the attack on the USS Maine was an actual attack or if it was staged so that we had reason and rationale to possibly intervene in Cuban affairs. Okay? Whichever it was, whether it was an accident, which is plausible, there might have actually been just an explosion of ordnance on the ship as a complete accident. The sensationalism of the explosion pitted all the blame on Spanish sympathizers. That gave cause for Americans to intervene in Cuban affairs. And if there was such a thing as Cuban independence, if the United States fought on behalf of the Cuban revolutionary side, there had to be something done. It was debated as to whether or not, if Cuba actually won its independence from Spain, should Cuba become a United States territory? And the prevailing thought at the time was that no, let's not make it a territory. Let's not try and possess it. We're going to help Cuba obtain independence, but we're not going to make it one of our territories. So you have the Teller Amendment. Henry Teller, who was a Colorado politician at the time, introduced a bill that was passed called the Teller Amendment, which basically stated we're not going to occupy or claim Cuba should they obtain independence. So with that in mind, later on that spring, the United States begins to send resources to Cuba to fight against the Spaniards. And what became known as the Spanish-American War in 1898 lasted really just about 4 or 5 months. That's it. Okay? The Cuban rebels that had been fighting for independence bore the brunt of the action. We brought to them armament. We brought them some additional troops. In this sense, we had more mop-up duty against the Spaniards. Really, the overwhelming majority of Americans that died as a result, you had only about 400 to 500 Americans who actually died as a result of combat, even though we sent 28,000. About 5,200 would suffer casualties from illnesses like malaria, typhoid fever, dysentery, or of battle wounds and infections. So if you were an American soldier fighting in the Spanish-American War, you were far more likely to die from some sort of disease or natural cause than you were by the actual Spanish hand. Okay, so you did have some African American units who served in that war, and they were specifically um, lumped together in various different groups. But additionally, in Cuba, or in addition to Cuba, you also had the Philippines. Remember, the United States wants access and influence in the South Pacific. Well, the Philippines are right there, right in the South Pacific. Okay? Yeah, you're right along, not that far from the southern coast of China and French Indochina, and not that far from Australia, not that far from, other different island nations. And so, huh, it happens to be strategically in a place of strong influence for what you're looking for. And it's a Spanish colony. Spaniards are weak. We're fighting against the Cubans. We're fighting a war now against the Spanish because they attacked us. USS Maine, remember that, right? So the United States decides to intervene in the Philippines, and eventually, um, Naval Commander George Dewey receives messages um, to go ahead and attack Manila. You're going to lead a squadron of naval ships into Manila's harbor, Manila being the capital of the Philippine colony. And you're going to force the colonial government in the Philippines to surrender. By this time, the United States Navy, definitely powerful. Troops on the ground that fought both there and in Cuba, not so much. See, after the American Civil War, the United States Army had somewhat disintegrated and became a little bit more disheveled. Most of the experience that Army officers had was fighting Native Americans on the plains and trying to corral Indians. They didn't have large scale Army training. So you had poorly trained troops. Many of them actually wore uniforms that were designed they were wool, they were thick. Yeah, you might fight in something like that in colder weather, but it doesn't get cold in the Philippines. It doesn't get cold in hot Cuba. Okay? So you had U.S. troops that were poorly outfitted. You had sweltering heat, both in the Philippines and in Cuba. But fortunately, hardly any shots were fired in the Philippines. The Navy had really solidified and done enough damage and really scared the Philippine colonial government into action that they just basically surrendered. Okay? So, going back to Cuba, you have various different battles that take place, and believe it or not, the Spaniards actually put up a pretty decent fight. But it was too much. They just couldn't quite handle it, didn't have the resources, and didn't quite have the wherewithal to want to keep Cuba that badly. A future American president, Theodore Roosevelt, gained some fame at this time. He actually served with an army unit called the Rough Riders, who worked up some of the hills in Cuba to take various different important and strategic hills that overlook certain valleys to give strategy. So basically, a very basic concept in military strategy is to take what's called the high ground. Because when you're up high, you're at a strategic advantage. You can see what's below you, and you're basically at like a 3-to-1 advantage, because in order to remove you, an oncoming enemy force is going to have to run uphill. And they can't see everything at the top of the hill. Whereas if you're at the top of the hill, you see everything, and you're not having to struggle uphill. So that was one of the things. And Teddy Roosevelt actually gained fame as a result of his actions with the Rough Riders. So hold that thought. Otherwise, though, fighting would eventually cease, and the United States would move on to Puerto Rico, another Spanish territory. And Puerto Rico had been occupied by the Spaniards since the very early days, since almost around the time of Christopher Columbus's stumbling into the Caribbean. For the better part of 400 years at that point, the Spaniards had been in Puerto Rico. And there had been various different resistances in Puerto Rico to Spanish colonization in recent decades by the late 1890s. But things changed. And eventually, when American military forces would take Puerto Rico from the Spanish forces in 1898, there would be a question about how Puerto Rico, just like with Cuba and the Philippines, would have become United States territory. But it was deemed that Puerto Rico, unlike Cuba and unlike the Philippines, would eventually become a United States territory. And the U.S. maintained control there for a while, but eventually, about 15, 20 years later, Congress would pass an act that would officially make Puerto Rico not just a United States territory, but it would make everyone that lived there a United States citizen. So that is why Puerto Rico is important to the United States. Puerto Rico is a United States territory. Puerto Ricans are Americans. They're not a state. Okay? And that is something that Puerto Ricans have clamored for, is possible statehood that could have all sorts of political and funding ramifications and benefit. So that's something that they fight for to this day. But otherwise, if you're from Puerto Rico, you're an American. And that's why Puerto Ricans have things somewhat easier in the United States than other Latinos. Puerto Ricans don't have passport or immigration issues because Puerto Ricans are Americans. Yeah, if a Puerto Rican wants to move to Wyoming, I don't know why they would, but if they wanted to, they could. I wonder how many Puerto Ricans there are in Wyoming now that I think about it. I could probably count on one hand if there are any, but whatever. That'd be interesting. The debate over the Philippines would now run over the idea of what is the United States to become. Cuba's going to become its own country. We have annexed Puerto Rico and will eventually make it a territory, but what do we do about the Philippines? There is staunch anti-imperialist sentiment in the Philippines. People wanted to rid the Philippines of Spanish colonial control, but the people there also did not want to replace one imperial power with a different imperial power. So the question became, okay, as Philippines now have declared their independence and won it, what now? Should the United States annex the Philippines, thereby solidifying to a larger territory in the South Pacific, or should they leave it alone? There became a large argument for annexation for the Philippines, but you have anti-imperialists who were weary of being compared to the old Europeans that we fought against in the first place anyway. And ultimately, it was decided that the Philippines would become their own.